3 children sacks over their heads, sold in the open market like they were nothing. And then a single whispered name from the past turned one man's world upside down. Don't click away, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe now, because the next part of this story only gets more intense. The morning broke with a pale sun hanging low behind the hills, spreading a weak warmth across the fields that had known better days. Daniel walked beside his father Boots, crunching on the hard dirt road leading into town. It had been a long time since the two of them had gone anywhere together other than church on Sundays, and even longer since either of them had laughed out loud without feeling guilty afterward. The boy swung a little satchel on his shoulder, trying to match his father's steady stride. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, though thinned out by years of hard work and harder winters, walked with a quiet purpose, his jaw set. His name was Thomas Boone, though most in town just called him Boone. Since his wife had passed, he had carried himself like a man carved out of stone, keeping on with the work, because he had no other choice, because a boy of 12 couldn't raise himself. Daniel knew this, though his father never said it. Today was supposed to be simple. Flour nails, lamp oil, maybe a spool of thread. Essentials. They had been saving for this trip for weeks, his father tucking away coins with careful thought. Daniel felt a little thrill being out here with him, like maybe for once the day might hold something other than chores and silence. The market was already alive when they arrived. Stalls lined the main square, the smell of bread mixing with the sharper tang of horses and sweat. Folks called greetings, though his father gave little more than nods. Daniel waved back anyway, cheerful in a way that seemed to soften a few of the faces turned toward them. They'd just passed the blacksmith stall when Daniel felt the air shift as if a chill had crept through the crowd. He slowed, tugging at his father's sleeve. "Pa, look." Off to the side near the old hitching post stood 3 figures. Small, too small for the sacks tied down over their heads. Their hands were bound behind them with rough cord bare feet pressed into the dirt. A plank of wood painted in crooked letters leaned against the post orphans, $3 each. Most folks gave them a glance and moved on. A few frowned, muttered, and kept walking. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. "Pa," his voice cracked a little. "We can't just leave 'em." His father looked down at him, brows drawn tight. "Daniel, come along. Not our business. But they're just kids." Daniel pressed his hand, gripping tighter on his father's sleeve. "Look at 'em, Pa. They ain't much older than me." Boone's eyes flicked over the scene, his face hard. "Boy, we ain't got room. You know what we came for. Them children. They'll only be a burden we can't carry." Daniel felt a weight press into his chest. He turned back toward the 3 little bodies standing so still under those sacks, like they'd forgotten what it meant to move. A man with a red face and short suspenders stood nearby, calling out half-heartedly to the crowd. $3 each, folks. Don't matter which one you pick. They'll work, they won't cry, and you ain't gotta feed 'em much. $3, and they're off your hands." The way he said it made Daniel's stomach twist, like he was talking about tools or animals, not boys with beating hearts. "Pa, please," Daniel whispered, tugging harder. Boone shook his head, but Daniel could see the doubt creeping in. The boy searched for something, anything that might reach him. And then the words came, the same ones his mother used to say when she gave bread to strangers who knocked on their door. Ma always said, if you turn away from someone who needs you, you turn away from the Lord himself. The line hung in the air like smoke. Boone flinched almost visibly, his jaw tightening. He hadn't heard that voice, her voice, in years. Not like that. Before he could answer, the man in suspenders stepped forward, cutting the cords at the smallest boy's neck. The sack dropped away. The child blinked in the light, face thin but eyes startlingly clear. He looked straight at Boone, not Daniel, not the crowd, and in a soft, steady voice he said, "Elizabeth." The market seemed to still. Boone froze, every muscle locked. That name, his wife's name. His hand twitched at his side. For a long moment, Daniel thought his father might turn and walk away, pretend he hadn't heard. But then Boone's gaze shifted down to his son, who was staring at him with wide, pleading eyes. He let out a long, rough breath and reached into his coat. His fingers brushed against the worn leather pouch. Inside were 6 silver half-dollars saved over months, meant for flour and nails and oil. He counted quickly. 3 whole dollars. No more. He closed his eyes, heard his wife's voice again, soft and sure. "Don't turn away." 3, Boone said, holding out the coins. His voice was hoarse. "I'll take all 3. The auctioneer blinked, then grinned wide, snatching the money. "All right then, they're yours." Daniel stepped forward, reaching for the small boy's hand. The little fingers curled into his without hesitation, and something in Daniel's chest settled like a promise had just been sealed. Boone cleared his throat, nodded once. "Let's go." The wagon rolled along the rutted road wheels, groaning as if they too carried the weight of what had just happened. Daniel sat close to the edge of the wooden bench, his shoulders hunched, not from the chill of the early evening, but from the tension of knowing 3 boys, not strangers anymore, but not family, yet rode in the back. They sat quiet as fence posts, knees pulled up, eyes fixed on the road as though watching it would keep them steady. Boone held the reins steady, the mare plodding with the kind of patience only an old farm horse had left. He hadn't spoken since they left the market. Daniel didn't know if it was anger, doubt, or something else, something softer buried deep, but he knew better than to ask. The silence between them felt thick, like a blanket that kept out the cold, but also smothered every easy word. He glanced over his shoulder once. The smallest boy, the one who had spoken that name, had tucked himself close between the other 2. His eyes were wide, not with fear exactly, but with something Daniel couldn't name, a look that made his chest ache. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. His voice was low, rough from years of keeping too much unsaid. "How'd you know that name, boy?" he asked, not looking back, eyes fixed on the road. The oldest, a lean figure with sharp eyes, shifted. "We didn't. Not here. I saw her in a dream. She told us if we need help to say her name. Said someone would come." Daniel felt his father stiffen beside him. For a long time there was only the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of hooves. Then Thomas asked softer this time, "What did she look like?" "Beck," the boy had said. His name was Beck. Looked straight ahead, voice steady. She was kind, warm, like a fire you don't want to leave. She said her name was Elizabeth. Daniel's father said nothing more. He only flicked the reins once as though to keep the horse moving, but Daniel saw his jaw working, the muscle tight. The name, his mother's name, still hung between them all, heavy as a church bell. When they reached the farm, the light had faded into the soft gray of evening. The house sat low against the slope of the valley, its roof sagging a little, the barn leaning to one side. The fields, once neat rows of corn and beans, had gone mostly to seed. The place looked worn, tired, but it stood, and it was theirs. The boys didn't move when the wagon stopped. Thomas stepped down first, boots crunching on the packed dirt, and handed the reins to Daniel. Inside, he said quietly, not harsh, but firm. The eldest was the first to jump down. Without a word, he turned and helped the other 2. They followed Daniel toward the porch, their steps small and careful like shadows afraid of being noticed. Inside the house smelled of wood smoke and old pine. The stove still held a little warmth from the morning. Thomas set his hat on the peg and stood a moment as if he had to remind himself this was happening, that he'd brought 3 more souls under his roof. Then, without another word, he moved toward the cupboard. Daniel set a kettle on the stove, filling it from the water pail, his movements quick but nervous. He opened the cupboard, pulled down a jar of dried beans and a sack of flour his father had meant to make last through the month. His father didn't stop him. "Sit," Thomas said simply, and the boys obeyed, lowering themselves onto the bench by the table, silent eyes darting between the man and the boy, who seemed less a stranger than the rest of the world. Daniel stirred a batter with one hand, watching them with the other. He kept his voice gentle. "What's your name?" he asked the smallest. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Milo." Daniel nodded and turned to the middle one. Harris came the soft reply, eyes downcast. The eldest met Daniel's gaze for a long moment before saying, "Beck." Daniel smiled, small but real. He set the pan on the stove, spooned batter into it. "I'm Daniel," he said, though he figured they already knew. For a while only the sound of batter sizzling filled the room. Finally Daniel spoke again, quieter. "Milo, you said my ma's name. How'd you know it?" The little boy shrugged, scratching at his wrist. "Just knew." "Did someone tell you about her?" Daniel asked. Milo shook his head. "Did you meet her before?" Again the shake of a small head. Then Milo looked up. Really looked eyes too young to lie, but too old to trust the truth easily. The batter hissed louder as Daniel froze. Beck stiffened. Harris looked at the floor. Thomas, standing near the stove, didn't move, though his hand trembled as he flipped the pancakes. "What?" Lady Daniel asked softly. "She didn't say her name," Milo whispered. "But she was kind, warm, like you." The room went still. No one spoke for a long time. Then Beck stood, his voice hard but shaking at the edges. "I don't care how he knew your name, but if you're gonna hurt us, do it quick. Don't drag it out." Daniel's father turned, brow furrowed. "I won't hurt you." They all say that Beck shot back. "Well," Thomas said, flipping the pancakes with more steadiness than he felt. "I won't say it again." They ate like wolves, tearing into the food with a hunger that said more than words could. No laughter, no chatter, only the scrape of forks and the clink of mugs. When the plates were empty, Thomas brought out old blankets, laying them near the hearth. "You sleep here tonight," he said. "Clean clothes are in the chest. If you run, I won't come after you, but I'll leave the lantern on till morning." He turned, started up the stairs, then stopped. His voice was softer this time. "Tomorrow, we'll talk about what happens next." But they didn't sleep, and neither did he, because what Milo had said replayed in his mind again and again, words he'd never spoken aloud, not even when he knelt at Elizabeth's grave. Let someone need me again. Let someone say her name. And now a boy had. And 4 lives, maybe more, were about to change forever. Morning came without ceremony. The clouds hung low and gray like the sky itself had stayed up watching. Thomas had barely closed his eyes, but at the first crow of the rooster, faint and half-hearted, he was already downstairs, already starting the fire again. The boys hadn't moved much. Milo was curled under a blanket nearest the hearth, a thumb pressed gently against his lip, not quite sucking it, just holding it there like it might keep the silence company. Harris lay rigid on his back, hands clenched over his chest, as if bracing for someone to drag him out by the collar. Beck sat upright in the farthest corner, knees tucked, head high, eyes fixed on the door, and then on Thomas, watching every move. Thomas poured hot water from the kettle into a basin, rolled up his sleeves, started mixing soap. He didn't ask who was hungry. He knew. He didn't ask who was dirty. That much was clear. He didn't crowd them, not yet. But when he set a stack of folded shirts and woolen trousers on the bench beside the stove, his voice was calm, steady. "You can wash in the barn," he said. "There's privacy there. Towels in the red box. Beck, you go first. Then Harris. Milo, you're last. Don't come back in till you're clean." For a moment, none of them moved. Beck's jaw tightened. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I want to," Thomas answered, meeting his eyes. "People don't do things just to be kind. That's because people forget how much kindness can cost," he said. Beck didn't reply. A minute later, he stood, took the clothes, and walked out the back door. By the time Harris followed, Thomas was already mixing oats into a pot of boiling water, slicing the last of their apples, adding a pinch of cinnamon he'd been saving for a day he didn't think would come. Milo lingered in the doorway, shoulders hunched. Can I keep my name?" he asked quietly. Thomas turned. "Why wouldn't you people change 'em when they take you in?" "I won't," Thomas said. "Good," Milo whispered. "'Cause I think God gave it to me." Something in Thomas's chest wavered. He cleared his throat. "You warm enough?" Milo nodded. "Go on then," Thomas said, nodding toward the barn. The sky lightened as they bathed and changed. Beck was the last to return, hair-damp shirt too big but clean. He didn't sit. He stood at the table like he was waiting for orders. "I'll do chores," he said. "You don't need to," Thomas replied. "I want to." That changed something. Thomas led him outside, showed him the tool shed, the leaning chicken coop, the vegetable patch that hadn't seen a spade in months. Beck didn't ask questions, just nodded and went to work. Harris was sent to stack firewood. Milo followed Daniel through the house, helping fold linens, collect dishes. It wasn't a perfect day. There were awkward silences, sudden flinches. Milo dropped a plate when Daniel spoke too sharply about the mud on his boots. Harris wouldn't meet Thomas's eyes. Beck didn't come in for lunch. But by the time the sun dipped past the ridge, there was warmth in the house that hadn't been there in years. Thomas stepped onto the porch as the sky burned with the last of the day's light. He looked back through the window and saw Daniel and the boys near the hearth. Milo laughing softly at something Harris had said. Beck passing a piece of bread across the table. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt something stir in him, something dangerously close to hope. The sound came sudden, 3 sharp knocks, cutting through the quiet like a hammer on iron. Thomas froze on the porch hand resting on the rail. Inside, Daniel's head snapped up. The boys gathered near the hearth, stiffened all at once. Milo clutched the edge of his blanket, eyes wide. Thomas stood a moment listening. The knocks didn't come again, but the stillness afterward felt heavy, as though the night itself was holding its breath. He stepped back to the door and opened it. On the porch stood Reverend Jacob Stokes, tall and narrow as a fence post. His black coat buttoned high, hands folded in front of him the way he always did, like he was praying even when he wasn't. His eyes carried the calm of a man used to speaking in silence before speaking aloud. "Afternoon, Boone," the Reverend said softly. "Heard you brought something home from town." Thomas stepped outside, pulling the door nearly shut behind him. "I did," The Reverend tilted his head, studying him with the steady patience of a man who rarely rushed his words. Some of the townsfolk said you'd lost your mind, said maybe you took leave of your senses. Maybe I have, Thomas answered, his voice even though his jaw tightened. They're not livestock, you know. Stokes went on, his tone not unkind, but edged with warning. I know, Thomas said. They've been passed from place to place more times than most hounds. Folks take 'em in, then send 'em back. The Reverend's eyes lingered on him. That oldest one, Beck. Heard tell he once broke a man's nose clean with a horseshoe. He won't be breaking mine, Thomas replied. His voice wasn't sharp, just steady, the kind of steady that left no room for doubt. Stokes sighed long and deep. You want me to speak with the county clerk, get their names written down, make it proper? Not yet, Thomas said after a moment. I need to know they'll stay. I wouldn't count on that, not with the history they've carried. Thomas glanced past the Reverend toward the dark line of hills, their edges softened by dusk. When he looked back, his voice was quiet but firm. Then I'll make new history. The Reverend gave a faint smile. Always were stubborn. Guess you learned that from the best. He tipped his hat, turned to leave. But before stepping off the porch, he said, Boone, I hope you know what you're doing. One boy's trouble enough. 3, well, that's near resurrection. Thomas didn't answer. He only nodded once, then watched the Reverend's tall frame fade into the gathering dark. When he stepped back inside, Milo was peeking from behind the curtain, eyes round. Who was that? The boy asked softly. Just someone who worries too much, Thomas said, closing the door behind him. He's scared, Milo whispered, clutching his blanket tighter. Scared of what might happen to us. So am I. Thomas admitted, his voice low, more to himself than to the child. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the boys were still too awake to sleep, Thomas pulled an old Bible from the trunk at the foot of the stairs. He set it on the table, its leather cracked from years of being opened and closed, carried to church and back, prayed over and cried on. The boys watched quietly, uncertain. When I was your age, Thomas said, his hand resting on the worn cover, my pa read from this every night. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. But I thought maybe you'd want to hear something from it tonight. None of the boys spoke. Daniel shifted in his chair, glancing at his father, then at the boys. So Thomas opened the book, the pages rustling like dry leaves, and began to read in a steady, calm voice. He setteth the solitary in families. He bringeth out those which are bound with chains. He didn't look up, just turned the page, and kept reading the words rolling through the room like the slow current of a river. By the time he closed the book, Milo was asleep on the bench, small chest rising and falling under the blanket. Harris had curled himself in a corner, clutching his knees but breathing easier. Beck's eyes were still open, but he wasn't watching the door anymore. He was watching Thomas. Thomas blew out the lantern. The room sank into shadow, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like something had moved in something small and fragile but real. The first real test of the house came not in daylight when chores kept hands busy and silence could be filled with the scrape of wood or the clatter of dishes, but in the deep hours of night when the wind worked its way through the cracks and the mind left to itself wandered into places darker than the sky outside. It was just past midnight when Boone stirred from a shallow sleep, not because of a noise from outside, but because of the kind of silence that made a man sit up in bed. He listened. The fire had burned low. The old dog out back hadn't barked. Then he heard a sound that didn't belong, ragged and harsh, like someone gasping through a closed throat. A scream followed, sharp and raw, the kind that tore through walls like they weren't there. Thomas swung his legs off the bed. Daniel had already bolted down the hallway, bare feet hitting the floorboards. Thomas grabbed the lantern, its flame dim, but enough, and followed. The boys' room door stood open, and the sight inside froze him harder than the winter air. Beck thrashed in his bed sheets, tangled around his legs, sweat soaking his shirt. His mouth was open wide, the scream breaking down into a hoarse cry. One arm clawed the air, fingers curled as if grabbing at something invisible. Harris stood by the window, pale, stiff, too afraid to move. Milo sat on his cot, hands clamped over his ears, tears sliding down his cheeks. Daniel rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Beck. He gripped the boy's shoulders, his own voice shaking. "Beck, it's not real. You're safe. You're home." But Beck didn't wake. His body jerked, a choked sob spilling out words caught in the middle of cries. "Stop. Please stop. No more, I'll be good. Thomas set the lantern on the floor, moved to the other side of the bed. He didn't touch him yet. He knew too well how sudden touch in a dream like that could feel like another blow. But Daniel's arms tightened, desperate to break through the terror. Beck Daniel called again, louder now. "It's me. You're not there. You're here." Beck's eyes snapped open as though a douse of water had hit him. His chest heaved, every muscle locking rigid. For a second he looked around, wild, not seeing, not knowing. Then he recoiled, nearly falling off the bed, pushing away. "Don't touch me!" he shouted. Daniel froze, his own breath sharp. Thomas leaned in, voice low but steady. "You were dreaming. Just a dream." Beck blinked, staring at the shadows, his skin pale under the sweat. His chest heaved like he'd run miles. He lifted a hand, covered his face. Milo's quiet sobs filled the silence. "I'm sorry," Beck whispered, voice breaking. "Didn't mean to wake anyone. Didn't mean—" Harris stepped forward finally, still pale but steady. "He does this sometimes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not always this bad, but sometimes." Beck's voice trembled as he lowered his hand. "Should I sleep in the barn? I'll be quiet. I swear." Thomas shook his head. "No one's going to the barn. You stay here." Beck's gaze shifted toward Milo. "I scared him." Milo wiped his eyes with his sleeve, whispered, "It's okay." Beck swallowed hard. "I dreamed he was back. The man, the one who bought us before the last place. I don't remember his name, just his boots. He always smelled like rope. I thought I was back there." Thomas felt something deep twist in his chest. He kept his voice steady. "You're not. You're here." "I know," Beck whispered. He sat a little straighter, though his body still shook. They sat in silence a while, the only sound the wind scratching at the roof. Finally, Thomas stood. "We'll make tea now," Harris asked. "It helps," Thomas said. "Reminds us where we are." So they followed him silent as shadows down to the kitchen. The lantern lit the wooden walls in soft gold. Thomas boiled water, let each boy pick a mug. Milo chose one with faded blue flowers, Harris a plain gray one. Beck waited until Thomas held one out, an old tin cup with a dented rim. He took it without a word. They sat together at the table, sipping slowly. Beck's hand still trembled, but his breathing evened. Milo's voice, soft as a whisper, broke the quiet. "Are nightmares like memories?" Thomas looked at him, then answered, "They're what memories do when you try to forget them too fast." The boys nodded like that made sense, though no one spoke after. They stayed at the table until the rooster crowed again. None of them went back to sleep, but somehow when the morning came, it felt a little less lonely. Later that morning, frost still on the ground, Thomas handed Beck an axe. The boy stared at it, unsure. "You want me to chop wood?" Beck asked. "I want you to do something that'll make your arms tired and your mind quiet," Thomas said. "But you're not touching that pile till I show you how. You nick the blade and you'll be sharpening it till Easter." Beck nodded, determination flickering under the uncertainty. Thomas showed him how to grip, how to balance, how to swing. Beck listened close, his face tight with focus. It was slow going, his arms trembling after each strike, but by noon sweat streaked his forehead and the pile of kindling had grown. Harris, meanwhile, helped Daniel in the garden. He didn't talk much, but Thomas watched how carefully he handled things. Seeds, roots, dirt, as if pressing too hard might make them vanish. When he found a worm in the soil, he lifted it gently, set it aside, then kept digging. At one point, Daniel asked quietly, "Did you ever have a family?" Harris glanced up. "I did. Where are they now?" Harris hesitated, then said softly, "Gone." Inside, Milo swept the floor, not because anyone told him to, but because he liked making lines in the dust. He hummed softly old hymn fragments without full verses. "This little light of mine," he murmured again and again, not even noticing Thomas could hear. That afternoon, Thomas found himself humming the same tune while repairing the fence rail. Days slipped by that way, steady as the turning of a wheel. 3, then 4, then a week. The boys began to change, though none of them seemed to notice. Harris started reading aloud by the fire at night. He stumbled often, but Milo clapped every time. Beck stopped asking to do chores. He simply did them. Thomas once caught him repairing a barn hinge with an old nail. When asked who showed him how, Beck shrugged and said, "You did, when you fixed the gate latch." Milo began leaving small drawings under Daniel's pillow. Crayon marks, smudged and crooked, always with their little house in them, always with the word home scratched in the corner. Yet it wasn't perfect. One evening, Harris came in with a black eye. Thomas saw it right away. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," Harris muttered. "Don't lie to me." Harris shifted his gaze to the floor. "Town boys. Said we were trash. Called Beck names. I told them to stop. They didn't. Did Beck fight back? No. He just stood there. Why didn't you run?" Harris shrugged. "We don't run anymore." Thomas knelt, lifted Harris's chin gently. The bruise was already swelling. "You're brave," he said quietly. "Foolish, too. Sometimes they're the same thing." He cleaned the wound, said nothing more. That night he made hot stew, let them sit closer to the fire than usual. Beck didn't speak much, but Thomas saw him slide Harris an extra slice of bread when he thought no one was looking. It was the next day the trouble came to their own doorstep. A horse trotted up the lane in the gray of afternoon. Thomas had just stepped from the barn when he saw the rider, a man in a dark coat, pale face under a wide brim hat, the sort of face you'd forget, except for the mustache curled neat at the edges. He dismounted, slow eyes scanning the house. Daniel, sensing something off, hurried to stand near Beck. Harris and Milo hovered close behind. The man held a folded packet of papers. "Afternoon," he said smoothly, though the edge in his voice was clear. "I'm here on business. These boys, you've got no claim to 'em." He waved the papers. Ward transfer signed proper. They belong with me. Thomas stepped closer, voice flat. They're not yours. The man's smile thinned. I paid good money. That makes them mine. You paid for flesh, not for family. The man tilted his head. Pretty word for stolen property. Beck's fists clenched at his sides. Say that again, he said, voice shaking, and I'll knock your teeth out. The man chuckled darkly. You think you can fight me, boy? You're nothing but a wild dog. Then we bite, Harris said, stepping beside Beck, his young face set hard. Milo clung to Daniel's arm, silent but trembling. The man's hand moved toward his coat. Thomas didn't wait. He lifted the rifle from where it leaned against the porch rail, steady as stone. Try it, he said. The man froze, hand hovering. You think I won't? Thomas asked. I think you're scared. I am, Thomas said, voice calm. But that don't mean I won't pull the trigger. For a moment, the world held still. Then the man lowered his hand, slow eyes narrowing. You'll pay for this, he hissed. They always find out. Always. They already did, Thomas said. And they left them with me. The man backed toward his horse, tied the sack he carried back onto the saddle, and rode off without looking back. Thomas didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hooves had faded into nothing. That night, none of them slept. They sat by the fire close together, the warmth doing little to calm Milo's trembling hands or the hard set of Beck's jaw. They'll come back, Beck said quietly. Maybe Thomas answered. But we'll be ready. Next time we fight, Beck added. No, Thomas said. Next time we stay together. That's how we win. Harris stared into the fire. They think we're weak. Then let 'em think it, Thomas replied. It's easier to surprise 'em that way. Beck gave a dry laugh, not out of humor, but because the words made sense. The next morning, Thomas took Daniel and the boys into town. They walked straight into the courthouse, into Judge Tomlin's office. Thomas laid the false papers on the desk. I didn't sign these, the judge muttered, adjusting his spectacles. Hammond's retired. Hasn't signed a thing in years. His face paled. Someone's forging legal documents to snatch children. You'll handle it, Thomas asked. You have my word. I don't want promises, Thomas said evenly. I want names, and I want peace. The judge nodded solemnly. They left with Milo tucked close at Thomas's side. That winter passed like a slow song. The days short, the nights long, but the house full of the kind of quiet routine that made life bearable. Beck built a sled from scrap wood. Harris read every book in the attic, stumbling but improving. Milo learned to write. His first word scratched in chalk on the cabin wall wasn't dog or cat. It was Daniel. When Thomas saw it, he turned away quick, but Daniel saw the moisture in his father's eyes. By spring, the garden rows bent in tidy arcs, cabbage heads, swelling beans climbing. Daniel worked beside Milo, whose backwards R's made him grin even as he practiced again. Beck and Harris shoveled near the coop shoulders, straight moving in rhythm. The place had begun to breathe again, as though the land itself had waited for their laughter. But Thomas knew peace was fragile, and so he kept the rifle oiled, the lantern lit by the door, and the old dog sleeping at the porch steps. Because the world had already tried to take these boys once, and he reckoned it might try again. Beck had grown since the winter sleeves creeping up his wrists, his voice carrying a depth that hadn't been there when Thomas first brought him home. Harris was filling out too careful in his movements, still quiet but stronger now. Even Milo had a confidence about him, scribbling his crooked letters on scraps of paper, trailing after Daniel like a shadow. But peace, as Thomas knew too well, was never built to last. It was a cold morning when he set out for town, planning only to bring back flour and lamp oil. He kissed the crown of Daniel's hair without thinking, mounted the old mare, and rode down the muddy road. Daniel watched until his father disappeared over the rise. Something in him pricked uneasy, though he couldn't have said why. By noon, the unease had turned into a stone in his gut. The sun slid low shadows stretched long, and Thomas had not come back. Daniel paced the porch, jaw-tight boots, scuffing the boards. Beck leaned on the rail, eyes scanning the road. He should have been back hours ago. Maybe the store was busy. Harris offered, though he didn't sound like he believed it. Milo sat on the steps, chin in his hands. He wouldn't stay gone this long. Daniel stopped pacing. No, something's wrong. He looked at Beck. We're going after him. Harris hesitated. What if he's just late? Daniel's eyes were sharp. What if he's not? Beck straightened. Then we find him. They didn't waste time. Daniel fetched the old rifle, checked the chamber, slung it over his shoulder. Beck belted on the revolver Thomas had shown him how to load. Harris slipped a knife into his boot. Milo clutched his wooden slingshot, jaw set, though his hands trembled. They started down the road their father had taken, the last of the daylight fading. Daniel's eyes swept the ground. Look here, he said, pointing. Hoofprints deep, turning off the main trail. They followed into the woods, boots crunching frost and leaves. Before long, Harris crouched, touching the dirt. Blood. Daniel bent low, a thin trail broken and uneven, staining the earth dark. He looked up, voice tight. He's hurt. Beck's face hardened, or someone hurt him. They pressed on. Branches clawed at their sleeves, the ground turning rougher. A low branch snapped above as though something or someone had been dragged through. Harris stopped, pointing ahead. There, the ravine. They climbed down the slope, careful on the slick clay. At the bottom, tangled in brush, they found a horse. Thomas's mare. The saddle torn, stirrup broken. Blood matted the animal's flank. She was alive but trembling. Daniel's breath caught. Pa. He swallowed hard. They took him. Beck's fists clenched. Then we take him back. The trail led east, twisting through thick pines. The blood grew faint, but Beck's sharp eyes kept them steady. At last, through the lattice of trees, they saw it, a shack, leaning like it had been forgotten by the world. Smoke curled faint from the chimney. Milo tugged Daniel's sleeve. Look. He pointed to a scrap of cloth, red, hanging from a nail on the porch. Daniel knew it, his father's bandana. Quiet now, Beck whispered. They crept closer, boots soft in the moss. The porch groaned under Beck's weight. He pressed his ear to the door. Silence. He pushed hinges, squealing. Inside smelled of smoke and sweat and something metallic. A chair lay broken, a coil of rope on the floor. And in the corner, Pa Daniel breathed. Thomas sat tied to a bedpost, wrists raw, face pale, a bruise swelling on his cheek. His eyes opened as they rushed in a flicker of relief, breaking through the weariness. I knew you'd come, he rasped. Beck cut the ropes, hands shaking. Did they hurt you? Not in the way they wanted. Thomas muttered, wincing as the bindings fell. He tried to stand, faltered, leaned on Beck's shoulder. Harris checked the window. No sign of them. They'll be back, Thomas said quietly. They left for supplies, and they weren't alone. Heard 'em say orphans fetch good coin, especially if they're already broken. Before Daniel could answer, Milo's voice cut in from the doorway. They're coming. Thought I told you to stay back, Beck hissed, but Milo's face was pale, eyes wide. 3 men, up the trail. Move, Daniel ordered. The back door opened onto a ravine, steep and slick. Beck helped Thomas down, Harris steadying from behind. Milo scrambled after them. The shout came from above. Gunfire cracked bark, splintering dirt, kicking at their boots. Down the hill, Beck shouted. They slid, half falling, half running. Harris fired once, the shot echoing. 1 man went down. The others scattered. They'll circle. Beck panted. Thomas's voice hoarse but firm. There's a mine shaft, 1/2 mile east. Used to trap there. Might buy us time. They pushed on. Milo slipped twice, each time yanked up by Harris. Thomas leaned heavy on Beck, sweat dripping despite the cold. The mine yawned black in the hillside boards sagging inward. Beck didn't hesitate. They ducked inside. The air was damp, stale. Old rails rusted on the floor. Farther in, Beck whispered, "Find a pocket." They settled at a bend, lantern dim. Footsteps echoed soon after, voices low and sharp. "They're in here. Won't get far." Beck's jaw tightened. He handed Thomas the revolver. "You shoot if they get close. No questions." Thomas nodded, grip steady, though his body shook. The first man came around the bend. Beck swung a piece of iron rail, catching him across the temple. He dropped hard. The second lunged, pistol raised. Harris tackled him from the side knife flashing. They struggled, grunts echoing off the walls. The third raised his weapon. A gunshot cracked from behind. Smoke curled from Thomas's revolver. His hands trembled, but his eyes stayed hard. "I didn't think I could," he whispered. "You did," Beck said, helping him lower the gun. "You saved us." But it wasn't over. The second man groaned, blood streaking his face, reaching for his weapon. Thomas stepped forward, kicked it away. "Please," the man rasped. "I was just doing a job." Thomas leaned down, voice cold. "You tell whoever sent you if they come near my boys again, I'll put the next one between their eyes." They left him crawling, took a side shaft Beck had spotted on the map. By the time they circled the ridge, the sky had gone dark, storm clouds heavy. They didn't speak, only moved 1 step at a time. When the farmhouse came into view at dawn, Daniel's breath caught not from exhaustion, but from relief, so sharp it ached. They had made it home. Inside, Thomas sank into the chair by the fire, the boys around him, Daniel close at his side. No one said much. They didn't need to. The silence held more than words ever could. But as the fire cracked and the light grew outside, Thomas's gaze lingered on the rifle propped against the wall. He knew the fight wasn't finished. Not yet. For a while after the mine, the house stood quiet. Not quiet in the way it had been before the boys came, hollow and heavy, but the kind of quiet that holds steady after a storm, when everything in you waits to see if the sky will break again. It took weeks before anyone dared speak of what had happened in those tunnels. The subject hung over them like a shadow. Even Milo, who asked questions about everything from why dogs wagged their tails to how beans sprouted, kept his tongue. Until one night when he stood drying dishes beside Daniel, his small hands clumsy on the cracked plates. "Will they come back?" he asked softly. Daniel glanced down at him, the lantern glow catching the worry in the boy's eyes. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, They might, but we're stronger now. And in the days that followed, they acted like it. Beck set to building a second fence line beyond the garden hammer echoing through the valley. Harris laid traps near the tree line, simple snares but clever ones, the kind that would trip a man as easy as catch a fox. Thomas brought home a dog, a big, solemn hound with patches of gray on his muzzle, a creature that slept at the foot of his bed and never let the front porch sit empty. Slowly the fear faded, though the memory didn't. They planted a tree near the edge of the field where the earth ran dark with old roots. Thomas had chosen the spot himself, saying the land there was strong. The sapling stood fragile but alive, a small thing against the broad sky. For them, it was enough. Winter gave way to spring before it bloomed. Milo was the first to see. He burst through the front door barefoot, mud streaked across his legs, shouting so loud the pie tin Daniel had been drying clattered to the floor. "It's got flowers!" Milo cried, face lit like a lantern. "Real ones white." The hound barked once, bounding after him tail high. Daniel followed to the edge of the field. Beck knelt beside the sapling, brushing a petal with calloused fingers. "Told you it would grow," he said quietly. Harris stood behind him, arms folded, trying to hide a grin. "You said it'd die in the first freeze." "Shut up," Beck muttered, though there was no heat in it. Daniel laughed, the sound surprising him with how easy it came. The boys were healing not just from the bruises or the long, cold months, but from something deeper, the ache of not being wanted. But peace, they were learning, always came with a price. That night, someone knocked on the door. It wasn't a gentle knock. 3 hard pounds, sharp enough to rattle the hinges, then silence. Beck was up first hand on the revolver they kept by the mantel. Harris moved to the window, peeling the curtain just an inch. His voice was low. "Rider. Alone. Horse looks run near to death." Thomas stepped into the hallway, his face grave. He motioned to Daniel. "Stay with the boys." Then, after a pause, he added, "I'll open it." He pulled the door wide. On the porch stood a boy barely older than Beck, hat too big for his head boots worn to the sole. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped like he hadn't slept in days. In his hand was a crumpled telegram. "You Thomas Boone?" he asked, voice hoarse. "I am," Thomas said. The boy handed him the slip of paper. "Came urgent. Said, if I didn't ride straight, some kids might die." Thomas unfolded it, the words scratching across the page in hurried script. 3 boys taken. Southbound wagon crossed river. Headed for auction. Need help. C. Thomas's chest tightened. He didn't need to ask who C was. Harris had told him in quiet moments about the broken network of children shuffled across counties, paraded as farm help church wards, anything that made the papers look clean. Some escaped, some didn't. Some, like C, stayed and tried to stop it. If this had come, it meant the need was real. Beck was already pulling on his boots. "I'll ride." "No," Thomas said firmly. "I will." "You can't." Beck started, voice tight. Thomas cut him off. "I'm not asking. I've stood in this house long enough trying to make a home for boys who never knew one. If there are 3 more out there, I won't stand by." He turned to Harris. "Saddle both horses. We leave in an hour." Harris didn't argue. He simply nodded. By dawn, the 4 of them were riding down the ridge, rain chasing them like wolves. Daniel rode close to his father, the hound loping behind until it fell away at the tree line. The trail was narrow and slick, the river swollen with storm water. They crossed at the shallow bend rocks red with clay water biting cold against the horse's legs. On the far bank, Thomas dismounted, crouched by a print in the mud. "Wagon," he said. "Heavy. 4 wheels." "How far?" Daniel asked. "Not more than a day." They pressed on. Trees thinned fields turned to dust. At dusk, they came upon a trading post with shutters drawn tight. The innkeeper was sweeping broken glass from the steps, the air holding the iron tang of blood. "3 boys came through here," Thomas said without greeting. "Bound. One was limping." The man looked up wary. "Why should I tell you?" Harris stepped forward, eyes steady. "Because if you don't, he'll ask again." He nodded toward Thomas, whose hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "And then I will." The man swallowed. After a long pause, he pointed south. "Wagon broke an axle, fixed it by dusk, headed to Porter's Mill, said something about a private auction." Thomas's jaw tightened. Porter's Mill was a day's ride, less if they didn't stop. They didn't. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the valley. From the ridge, they saw smoke rising from chimneys below dozens of tents pitched along the creek. Men walked with rifles, shadows moving between firelight. At the center stood a pen of crates and barbed wire. 3 boys huddled inside. One clutched his stomach. Another still had a sack tied around his neck. Thomas exhaled slowly. "We go in quiet." "No," Harris said, his voice sharper than usual. He opened his coat, revealing a stick of dynamite strapped inside. "We go in loud." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "You've been carrying that." "Only for the right cause," Harris replied. "And now is." Daniel's voice was steady. "Then now's the time." Beck tightened his grip on the reins. Milo, sitting small on his pony, reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of wood. He had scratched into it with his little knife the letters uneven but clear. "We are family." He held it up. "So we don't forget," he said simply. Thomas looked at each of them. The boy's fate had thrown into his life, his own son who had begged him to take them in the fragile bond they had built in the ashes of loss. He felt the weight of the rifle across his back, the throb of his old wounds, and the sharp pull of love he hadn't expected to feel again. "All right," he said. "We do this together." And under the rising moon, they started down toward Porter's Mill. They waited until midnight. The camp below flickered with firelight tents stretching in a half circle along the creek. The sound of rough voices carried on the cold night air, men laughing too loud, the occasional clink of bottles. Horses stamped near the edge of the clearing, their breaths turning white in the dark. Beyond them, stacked crates and a pen of wire stood in the glow shadows huddled inside. Children. From the ridge, Thomas Boone studied the scene, his jaw tight, his rifle resting across his knees. Beside him, Daniel crouched, eyes fixed on the pen. Beck knelt a few feet away, reins looped loosely around his wrist, the horse shifting under the weight of his tense body. Harris checked the dynamite again, his face pale, but his movements steady. Milo sat close to Daniel, small hands wrapped around the scrap of wood he'd carved earlier, the words uneven but clear. "We are family." They'd spent the day preparing, the hours dragging with the weight of what lay ahead. Thomas had sharpened the knife, checked the powder, gone over the plan again and again, until even Milo could repeat it back. Yet, as they watched the camp, now silence hung heavy. Thomas looked at Daniel, his boy who wasn't a boy anymore. Not really. Not after all they'd faced. "Stay close to me," he murmured. Daniel nodded once. His voice came steady, though his throat felt tight. "I will." They moved when the fire sank low, when the guards' laughter softened into tired talk. Harris struck the fuse from behind a barrel, the faint spark eating down the cord. Beck spurred his horse, charging the far side of camp, his shout tearing through the stillness. The explosion came sharp, not large, but loud enough to scatter men from their posts. Tents toppled, horses reared, voices rose in panic. Thomas and Daniel ran for the pen. The wire was rusted sharp and higher than Daniel had expected. He pulled the cutters from his belt, hands shaking. "Hold it steady," Thomas barked, steadying the metal as Daniel clipped. Inside, 3 boys blinked at them, too stunned to speak. One reached out. Daniel pressed a finger to his lips, then pulled the wire apart. "Come on." The boys scrambled out, stumbling toward freedom. Milo darted to the smallest, grabbing his hand. "Hurry!" Gunfire cracked. Shouts rose. A man lunged from the smoke pistol, raised his eyes wild. Daniel froze, too slow to lift his rifle. The shot rang out, and Beck was there. He shoved Daniel hard, the bullet striking him instead. Beck grunted, staggering back, his hand clutching his side. For a moment, Daniel could only stare, shock tearing through him like the shot itself. "No," Daniel shouted, catching Beck before he fell. Beck's eyes met his, fierce even through the pain. "We're family," he rasped. "Family means we take the hurt for each other." Thomas's heart lurched so hard he thought it might split his chest. He wanted to drop, to cradle the boy, to rage at the sky. But there was no time. The camp was chaos now, men shouting, smoke curling through the firelight. "Get him up!" Thomas barked. He fired twice, dropping 2 men who rushed from the shadows. "We run now!" Harris grabbed Beck's other arm, hauling him upright. Beck stumbled but stayed on his feet, his jaw clenched tight. Milo clung to Daniel's belt, pulling the smaller, rescued boy along. They ran through the smoke shouts, echoing behind them. Harris tossed the last stick of dynamite into a wagon. The explosion rocked the campfire, licking into the night, scattering what courage the men still had. "Go!" Thomas roared. They mounted fast, Daniel pulling Milo up in front of him, Harris steadying Beck behind. Thomas swung onto his horse, last rifle in hand. Shots cracked in the distance, bullets kicking dirt at their heels, but no one dared give full chase through the flames and chaos. They rode hard hooves, pounding the rescued boys, clinging to anyone they could. Daniel felt Milo's small chest heaving against his arm, his tears hot against the cold air. He looked back, once, saw Beck hunched, but holding steady, Harris gripping the reins with fierce focus. By dawn, the ridge lay behind them, the smoke of Porter's mill, a faint smear in the sky. They didn't slow until the farmhouse came into view, its roof catching the first pale light. Only then did Thomas ease his horse, sliding down stiffly. They carried Beck inside, laying him near the hearth. Thomas ripped cloth for bandages, hands working fast though they shook. The bullet had grazed deep, tearing flesh, but missing bone. Beck winced, his face pale, but he stayed quiet. "You damn fool," Thomas muttered, voice rough as he tied the bandage tight. Beck managed a faint grin. "Better me than him." He nodded toward Daniel. Thomas's throat burned. He wanted to say 100 things, that Beck wasn't his by blood, but had become his all the same, that no boy should have to take a bullet, that he wasn't ready to lose another child. But the words stuck. So he only said, "Your family. That means you don't throw yourself away." Beck's eyes closed, but he whispered, "Family means you do if you have to." The room went quiet, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Milo curled close to Beck's side. Harris sat with his knife still in his hand, too tense to let it go. Daniel leaned against the wall, face-pale eyes fixed on the boy who'd saved his life. Thomas stood slowly looking at them all. He thought of Elizabeth, then her voice in the night, the promise she'd once whispered, "Let someone need me again." And he realized she had given him not just one boy to save, but a family to fight for. In the days that followed, the house filled like it had never before. The rescued boys found their voices slow at first, laughter breaking through only in small bursts. The hound watched them all tail wagging when Milo sang, when Harris read aloud, when Beck managed a slow step outside Daniel at his shoulder. Word spread through the valley. Folks started calling the place Boone's Light. A name Thomas never asked for, but one that stuck because in a world that had tried to bury children in silence and fear, this house stood with its doors open and its lantern lit. Under the blooming tree they had planted months ago, Daniel and Thomas stood one evening watching the boys chase each other in the grass. Beck walked slower than the rest, but Milo hovered near him, Harris laughing for once. The rescued boys joined in their voices, carrying high into the fading sky. Thomas felt his throat tighten, the sting of tears he didn't bother to hide. "She'd be proud," he whispered. Daniel glanced up at him, knowing who he meant. Elizabeth. The petals fell soft from the branches, white against the green. And for the first time since laying her in the ground, Thomas believed her promise had come true. They had made a family, and it would stand no matter how dark the storms ahead. You know, friends, as I close this story, I can't help but sit back and feel the weight of what we've just walked through together. This wasn't just a tale about Thomas Boone, his boy Daniel, and those 3 children they chose to bring home. It's a story about what family truly means. Not the kind we're born into, but the kind we build when life gives us no other choice. We saw a man who'd lost nearly everything find the courage to open his heart again. We saw a boy, Beck, step into danger without hesitation, taking a bullet to protect his brother, because in his words, family means we take the hurt for each other. That right there, doesn't it say it all? Sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about sacrifice, about choosing love, even when it costs us. And through all the hardship, the fear, the threats, the nights that seemed too long, they built something stronger than walls or fences. They built trust. They built hope. They built Boone's Light, a home where children who had been discarded could finally laugh again. For me, that's the heart of it. The reminder that kindness is never wasted, and that when we choose to stand with one another even in the darkest times, we become the light someone else has been waiting for. So I want to hear from you, what part of this story spoke to you the most? Was it Daniel's faith, Boone's courage, or the boy's resilience? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it, because stories like this don't just entertain us, they change us if we let them. Thanks for being here, friends. Until next time, keep the light burning.